Hello. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes now about how writers use metaphors and symbols to enhance their work. These literary techniques help writers communicate by associating things with ideas. In other words, a metaphor or a symbol brings an idea together with a thing in order to more clearly explain that idea or to help a reader have more thoughts about that idea. For example, we often see this flag, which is a thing, to represent the idea of the United States. That is to say, when we see this flag, we think of the United States and all the ideas, both positive and negative, that we associate with the United States. The flag symbolizes the idea of the country. Discussing ideas in this way, by using metaphors and symbols, helps writers not only communicate ideas, but also add to those ideas through the physical qualities of these representative things. When we see the red, white, and blue of the United States flag, some of us think, for instance, of the red of patriots' blood and the white of the purity of their intentions. The physical properties of the flag help us get ideas about the thing it represents. Thus, we help ourselves as readers by paying attention to what writers do when they use metaphors or symbols. And we can start paying attention, we can start thinking about these ideas by looking at the concept of the metaphor, which we can think of as a kind of figurative language that identifies a thing with an idea. Now, when I say figurative language, I'm talking about language making an image or a figure in a reader's mind. For example, we might say that literature is the key that opens the doors of thought. And when we do that, we're saying, metaphorically, that literature and the key are the same thing. We're not saying that literature is like a key. We are saying that literature is a key. We're also implying that thought is a room with doors that can be opened by this key of literature. So notice how this figurative language is helping us understand the idea of literature in a few ways. We can also see something like this going on when we see the poet Robert Burns say, "My heart's in the Highlands a-chasing the deer." In this case, Burns is using a physical thing, his heart, to stand in for the idea of his emotions, of his desires, of what he really wants deep within his self. Now, it's important to know that he's not literally saying that his heart is in the highlands chasing deer, because that would be grotesque. Instead, he's using a special kind of metaphor called metonymy, in which a part of something represents the whole thing, in the way that Burns's heart is representing all of Burns. And metonymy, that interesting literary term that you can now throw around in conversation, kind of bridges the gap between the idea of metaphor and the idea of the symbol, which we can think of as a thing that represents an idea. Because we can't really experience ideas with our senses, we can't see the color of freedom, for instance, we can't smell depression, a symbol can help us comprehend these ideas by associating them with something we can sense. We can think much more easily about something we can imagine seeing or hearing or smelling than we can about something that we just have to think about in the abstract. So, for instance, we can't see freedom. It's an abstract concept that doesn't really have a visible presence, but we can see a bird cage with an open door. We can imagine seeing that in our mind, and in that way, the bird cage can symbolize the freedom, because we can imagine the bird flying away from its confinement in the cage and then experiencing that freedom. We can use our senses to better understand the abstract concept. Now, of course, symbols can stand for more than one thing. That represents part of their power. A symbol can mean one thing to one person and something else to another person. We can see this in the story Everyday Use, where the family quilts represent one thing to young Dee and quite a different thing to Maggie. The daughters clearly see the quilts as a symbol, but they see that symbol in different ways, and the conflict over how to read this symbol generates the conflict in the story. As you keep reading literature, you'll probably notice a lot of symbolism that you can read in your particular way, but consider the way that the author wants that symbol to be read, and maybe the conflict between your reading and the author's will generate some more interest in your reading of that literary work. In other words, as you keep reading literature, you can really help yourself by continuing to look for metaphors and symbols. Metaphors and symbols. Think about how these techniques add meaning and variety to a literary text by allowing readers to more easily understand ideas and to have more ideas about the thoughts that a writer wants to communicate. Indeed, as you keep doing your own literary work, you might find yourself using metaphors and symbols of your own and exercising your creativity in that way. As always, thank you for your time and attention.